Welcome, everybody. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining from. My name is Michael Anyala. I'm Senior Transport Specialist at the Asian Development Bank. And we would like to welcome you to this ADB Green Roads Toolkit webinar series. Today, we will discuss a very interesting topic on the future of road user charges in Asia and the Pacific. But before I hand over to our experts, I just want to make very brief announcements. So ADB, in collaboration with the International Road Federation, will hold a Green Roads workshop in Istanbul alongside the IRF World Congress. So this will be on the 14th of October, and you're all welcome. So if by any chance you'll be attending the conference, please come and join. The workshop will focus on basically applying the toolkit and then discussing how this can be applicable to various contexts. And then we'll go through some very practical exercises as well. And for anybody who is new to the ADB Green Roads Toolkit, please feel free to access this through the ADB website. It's free to download. We have also, in collaboration with the Asian Transport Outlook, produced Green Roads profiles for a number of countries from Asia and the Pacific. And you can find these on the Asian Transport Outlook website. Now, with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Ian Greenwood, who is ADB consultant, and he's actually been part of the team that has contributed to this ADB study on the future of road user charges in the Asia and the Pacific, together with the other two experts that Dr. Ian will introduce. So I'll hand over to Ian to moderate the rest of the session. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Michael. And coming to you from New Zealand, so it's evening here, but it's no doubt in for a very good session once again. For those of you who missed the little instructions at the start, throughout the webinar, if you've got a question, there's a Q&A box down the bottom of the screen. Type your message in there, and we'll try and do our best to make sure we pick them all up throughout the rest of the session. Just before we get on to this particular introductions, our next webinar is going to be on 2 weeks from now. There'll be invites and that coming through in due course, but that's with a series of disaster management and public safety out of the University of Melbourne. And some really interesting presentations should come that way, including around the mental health aspects of disaster management. So rather than just looking at the hard engineering side of things, looking at the very much the human elements as well. So keep an eye out for that one, and would love to have you join us once again. For today, as Michael said, there's a study that the ADB has been undertaking, I guess, best part of a year, maybe less, looking at the future of road user charges and how those, in particular, if countries are relying on fuel taxes, what happens as we transition countries to electric vehicles or low emission vehicles, and those fuel consumption simply isn't happening. So that's the background to the study, looking at what comes next and what the impact is. And we've got two wonderful presenters. I'm sort of riding on their coattails on the study, so I might be lucky to get my name on a footnote in the third page, but these two are very much leading a lot of the work. So two great presenters. First up is Serge, or Sergey, depends on which day of the week as to what I call him, and he won't tell me what he prefers. But he's got extensive experience, not just the fact that it's across 50 countries, but that's from very much doing the high-level institutional reform, right through the whole spectrum of asset management down to road maintenance. So I've been looking at road funds and everything else for a number of years now. So rather than me talk for longer, Serge, Sergey, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Let me just share my screen. So today I'll be talking about the study that the ADB has undertaken on the future of road user revenues in developing Asia and the Pacific. And specifically, I'll be talking about the first publication, that is the one that is the most advanced and that we're hoping to publish this year still. So that publication looks at road maintenance financing and cost recovery options. It looks at the road networks in 10 different countries, estimating the road maintenance needs and the budget allocations to road maintenance, and looking at road user revenues and estimating the levels of those road user revenues. All with the aim of determining to which degree those revenues and potentially the financing for road maintenance will be impacted by this transition to low carbon vehicles. So once we stop using fuel or start using less fuel, we will be paying less fuel taxes, and that will have a direct impact on road user revenues and possibly also an ongoing impact on maintenance funding. Now, this is a first publication of 3, and the other 2, the publication 2 looks at technology options. So what are the alternatives for fuel taxes, and how can we improve those alternatives to make them easier to collect and to increase the revenue that we are collecting, to provide a decent alternative. And the third publication looks at mapping the future. So it looks at modeling for these 10 countries. How will the transition to low carbon vehicles take place? How quickly will it happen? What will be the direct impacts on road user revenues? And to propose alternatives. How can we, over time, introduce alternative road user revenues to make sure that the revenue levels at least remain the same and preferably even increase? And with that, also the allocations to road maintenance. So I already mentioned 10 countries. From the Asian development member countries, 10 countries have been selected for this study. We aim to include a variety of different countries. So large countries, small countries, big populations, small populations, different road network sizes, different road standards in terms of paved roads, unpaved roads, different types of vehicle fleets. Some countries produce their own vehicles, others import all their vehicles, different GDP per capita. All these aspects of a country can have an effect on the transition speed to electric vehicles, but they also have an effect on the level of and type of road user revenues that are collected. So the graph here just shows 1 or 2 of these aspects. It looks at population density and GDP per capita. So we see that Mongolia, for instance, has a very high GDP per capita, or the highest of these 10 countries, but it has a very low population density. And then we have Bangladesh, which is more or less in the middle regarding GDP per capita, but it has a very high population density. And so each of these countries have their specific aspects. So like Vanuatu and Timor-Leste are very small island countries which have very small networks compared to, for instance, Pakistan that has a much larger network, as you will see in this slide. So as I was saying, Pakistan, 500,000 kilometers of roads, whereas if we're looking at Vanuatu, we're talking about 2,000 kilometers of roads. So there are big differences as you could expect. This also becomes visible once we look at road density. And then, of course, you can look at road density as the number of kilometers per area of land, or you can look at the road density in number of kilometers per 10,000 people, and that has a big difference. For instance, Bangladesh has a lot of roads given its land area, but if we look at the number of people, then it goes down to only 23 kilometers per 10,000 people, which is on the low side. Whereas Mongolia is the opposite. It has very few roads for its land size, but a lot of roads for its population size. In the graph, you'll see that also not only the road size and the road density differ by country, but also the degree to which these roads are paved. So some countries like Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Timor-Leste, to a certain extent, quite large portion of their road network is already paved, whereas other countries like Vanuatu, Mongolia, only 10% of their road network is paved. And that again has an effect on maintenance needs, but also can have an effect on the number of road users. We also looked at vehicle fleets in the different countries. So this presents the number of vehicles per 1,000 people to make it easier to compare. And we've distinguished between the two-wheeler, three-wheelers. The red, the yellow, orange is light-duty vehicles, and the greens are other vehicles, mostly heavy vehicles. And there again, you see differences. In 5 of the countries, we see a very large portion of 2 3-wheelers. So Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, Pakistan, and Timor-Leste. And the other countries, we see hardly any 2 3-wheelers, and it's mainly light-duty passenger cars that form the majority. And this also has an impact because 2 3-wheelers are very easy to convert to electric. They have a shorter lifespan, so they get renewed more quickly. But also electric 2-wheelers are quite widely available already. And there are even conversion kits to convert an existing carbon-based internal combustion engine motorcycle to an electric motorcycle. So this again can have an impact later on for the 3rd study when we start looking at the transition speed. Now, the number of electric and hybrid vehicles in these 10 study countries are still quite small. They're less than 1% in nearly all the countries, with the exception of Mongolia, that has a very high percentage of hybrid vehicles. Now, these are mainly second-hand Toyota Priuses from Japan, but they are hybrid vehicles. And Nepal, we see nearly 3%, which are mainly electric 2-wheelers, 2 3-wheelers that have been introduced over time. Now, even though these percentages are still very low at the moment, we do see that most of the countries have introduced financial incentives to promote the purchase and operation of electric vehicles. So these are usually lower rates on different duties and taxes and fees that vehicle owners have to pay. And there's a list there, and more detail is, of course, provided in the report. So what does this actually mean? If we first look at the current situation, what are the maintenance needs and what are the actual allocations to road maintenance? We see that the maintenance needs vary between something like 0.5% of GDP to 1.3% of GDP. Now that difference is already important because what we see is that the higher the needs are, the more difficult it, as a percentage of the GDP, the more difficult it is for a country to actually be able to finance those needs. What we also see is that the degree of coverage differs a lot by country, from very lows like 17% in Mongolia to relatively decent levels in Uzbekistan, where we're reaching 86% of the estimated needs. What this graph also shows is that some countries have road funds. So 5 of the study countries have road funds. And to a large degree, these road funds actually provide the financing for road maintenance. Now, when we start looking at road user revenues, I try and include this slide to explain a bit how we've organized or categorized the different road user revenues. So what we see is that you have 3 types of charges or revenue sources. These can be energy-based, so that's usually a fuel tax, but in future, in theory, it could also be an electricity tax. We have vehicle-based charges, which are mainly based on ownership, but they can also be based on the usage of the vehicle. And we have road-based charges. So road-based charges is that you have to pay to access a certain road or a certain network. And then we have payments or revenues that you have to pay to gain access, and you pay once only, and then you have access as much as you want, or you have usage charges where you pay according to the use you make. So a fuel tax is a usage charge. The more fuel you use, the more you drive, the more tax you pay. On the vehicle-based charges, most of them are access charges. So you pay tax when you import a vehicle, or a sales tax when you buy a vehicle, or when you first register your vehicle. And then you also have periodic annual payments in some countries where you have an annual registration fee, or a vehicle technical inspection fee, or a road tax in certain countries. Vehicle-based charges, they are also usage charges, the vehicle distance charging, although it's not used very much at the moment because of the technical challenges. It is being used in certain countries, like in New Zealand, they are using vehicle distance charging for certain vehicles. And road-based charging, the most well-known is, of course, tolling, which is a usage charge. The more you use a certain tolled road, the more toll you pay. But for instance, you also have the vignette that gives you, which you pay once, and that gives you unlimited access to a certain road network. So the colors used here are mainly so that we can recognize them in the following graphs. So I'll go quickly through a couple of countries just to show the variety that exists and how different countries will be affected in different ways. So the first is Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan collects more or less 4 times the amount of revenue from road users as what is actually needed for road maintenance. It doesn't mean that all the road maintenance is covered, but it collects a lot of revenue. There's a high dependence on the green, on the fuel-based revenues, but also on the blues, on the vehicle-based revenues. And you can see that if all the fuel-based revenue were to be lost, there would still be sufficient vehicle-based revenues to actually cover the road maintenance needs. So Uzbekistan is in a pretty good starting position. But even then, the fact that you would lose, this is what, $800 million in revenue per year, potentially over time. That is a very large impact. If we look at Pakistan, their situation is very different. They collect more or less double what they need in road maintenance needs. They collect in road user revenues, but you see very high dependence on fuel-based revenues. So more than 3/4 of their revenue is from fuel taxes, different types of fuel taxes and levies and duties. So if that were to drop off over time as we transition to electric vehicles, you see that what is left is actually insufficient to cover the road maintenance needs. Not to say that the impact on the economy of Pakistan would be enormous. We're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5, $6 billion in revenue that would be lost as we transition. Papua New Guinea is a very different situation. Here we see that the revenues are actually a bit lower than the road maintenance needs. Still a very high dependence on fuel-based revenues, so they stand to lose a lot of their very limited revenues that they are collecting. What is more worrying is that a lot of that fuel-based revenue currently goes to the road fund, or the road fund that is being established. So if that gets lost, it will have a direct impact on road maintenance financing. So for each of the countries, we've also looked at whether any of these road user revenues are directly earmarked to road funds. So if I just go back to Pakistan briefly, You will see that there is also an allocation to the road fund for the national highways, but that is based on tolling. So it's not directly affected by this transition to electric vehicles. Last country I'll talk about is Timor-Leste. They collect very little road user revenue and very high dependence on fuel-based revenues within that limited collection. Their situation is already quite dire because they are unable to finance the road maintenance needs from their road user revenues. Even their current allocation to road maintenance is higher than what they're collecting in road user revenues. But the big problem in Timor-Leste is that they're very dependent on petroleum revenues. The entire economy is. So as we move towards decarbonization, not just within Timor-Leste, but globally, and fuel demand goes down, that will have an enormous impact on their economy. So let me just look at the 10 countries together. So this is an overview of the different revenues, road user revenues collected by each country as a percentage of GDP to make it easier to compare them. And that is compared to the actual road maintenance needs and the allocation. So the road maintenance needs are up to the gray, the black and gray together, and the black is the actual allocation. So as we already talked about, we see that Papua New Guinea, then their needs are actually higher than their revenues, and Timor-Leste, their needs are a lot higher than their revenues. But what we also see is that the energy-based revenues are dominant in many countries, followed closely by the vehicle-based revenues. So the periodic, and these are vehicle-based revenues for the first time a vehicle enters the road network. So import duties, sales taxes, that kind of revenue. The periodic revenues, so the annual road registration fee or the annual road tax that is paid by vehicle owners, which is a very important revenue source in my country, for instance, in the Netherlands. We see that those revenue sources are very small in countries we've studied. And the same goes for road-based revenues like tolling, especially tolling is the main one. We see that is very limited. A lot of countries have plans to introduce a lot of tolling, but it is very limited. Now, just to give an idea of what happens as we transition to electric vehicles and we lose all this fuel-based revenue, and maybe some effects also on other road user revenues. This next slide shows what happens if we don't include the fuel-based revenues. And then we see that a lot of other countries also get into problems. For instance, Pakistan, where we saw that there was a very high dependency on road user on fuel-based revenues. We see that without those, they are unable to cover their maintenance needs. They are unable to cover their current allocations to road maintenance. Vanuatu gets problems. The problems for Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea only get larger, of course. Kyrgyz is getting into trouble. Bangladesh has troubles. Mongolia is still able to cover their needs, but only just. The only countries that are really able to still cover their needs are Uzbekistan and Cambodia. And that is because both have a very high dependency on vehicle-based revenues. So those are not as directly impacted by this transition to electric vehicles. So what this study, this first publication has actually shown is that the needs, the road maintenance needs vary from one country to another, that the allocations are in none of the countries are meeting the needs, although in Uzbekistan they're getting quite close. But in most countries, they have very big problems financing road maintenance. And where we look at the idea of having road user revenues cover the road maintenance needs with this traditional concept of the user pays principle, that is a threat in certain countries already, and that will only become worse as we start losing revenues from fuel taxes, and we start needing to depend on revenues from other road user charges. So this is only the first publication. It basically maps the potential issue that will happen. As I mentioned at the beginning, the second publication will start looking at possible solutions, possible alternatives to fuel-based road user revenues, whereas the third publication will actually map out a way forward. How quickly do we need to move in the different countries, and what is the best option for each country given their characteristics of their vehicle fleet, their road network size, their road network standards, etc. So let me end here and hand back to Ian.
Thanks, Serge. There's one or two questions there in the Q&A box. You might want to pick up the first one, the second one, whether you wish to deal with that now or we can have it verbally at the end, up to you.
Yeah.
Our second presenter is Alexandra. I think, like Serge, has pretty much worked on all the continents apart from Antarctica, and gained extensive experience right across the spectrum from maintenance through to asset management, and is going to give the next part of the discussion. So, Alexandra, please, over to you.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon. I hope you can see my screen on my presentation.
Yes.
In full screen or?
Well, we got the present, well, not at full screen at the moment.
Voila, here we go.
Yes, perfect.
Yes, so my presentation is a bit more practical orientated than Serge. I have less countries and I have more practical experience on implementing road funds or not, on generating road user charges. No statistics here, but more, let's say, a pragmatic view on how this works in different countries. And also looking a little bit at the trend and the history. So I picked 4 countries from which one is not an ADB country. Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan have been discussed already in terms of statistics. Serbia is really an interesting example. It doesn't have a road fund, but it's really interesting in what you can do wrong, what you shouldn't do. So it's worth discussing about it. Laos has a functioning road maintenance fund since a long time, but it has a lot of challenges. Generally speaking, the aim of a road fund, why do we establish a road fund, is to ensure stable funding for road maintenance. I'm European. In Europe, we have very little countries who have a road fund, and those who have are let's say, the younger EU member states. So we still had a stable road maintenance funding without the road fund, but it requires stable budget, stable income for the government, and it requires awareness of the governments that roads actually participate to the economic development of the country and are essential to support the country's development. If this is not granted, then of course we always would support road funds and earmarking. Second comment I wanted to make up front is that usually ministries of finance and also EMF do not like road funds and do not like earmarking. A Ministry of Finance likes to have his whole budget in one pot, so they can every year decide, depending on the priorities, where the money should be allocated to. IMF also is for centralizing of the budgets and no earmarking. And also the rationale behind this is, if you have a road fund, why don't you have a hospital fund? Why don't you have a school fund? And why don't you have whatever, many funds? And Uzbekistan is one country which at some point had a number of funds like this, probably 10 or more. which then, of course, starts to make a problem. So let's start with Kyrgyzstan. Serge already mentioned Kyrgyzstan a little bit. The interesting thing of Kyrgyzstan is that they had a law on the road fund in 1989. Voilà. So it is a long time. This law was like sitting, presenting, but it was not enacted. It was not used for 20 years. So the people in the Ministry of Transport, the road sector, always claimed for a road fund, but the government did not hear it. Now, a new road fund law was done just 2 years ago. The interesting thing also is that it was issued and then amended already 3 times in the last 2 years. But they established a road fund, which is working now. It's situated under the Ministry of Transport. Interestingly, the budget is still approved by the Cabinet of Ministers, so there is an earmarking in the law, but currently they are a little bit in the transition phase. It's not fully in place. So the road fund receives very large income with 50% of fuel tax. You will see in other examples that this is really high, and we will see how this goes. The budget has increased after creation of the road fund significantly. My experience with road funds over years is that if you are too ambitious and you earmark a lot, it usually doesn't last very, very well, a very long time. Kyrgyzstan is considering a lot of different options to raise additional road user taxes. One is to add a specific additional tax to the fuel. This was under discussions for the last year, and currently it's been abandoned. They call it the one sum, 1 liter approach, to say they should add something because the roads are really poor. But this is not really supported, neither by the population, neither by the parliament. The other options, which is looked at, and it's looked at by many countries, is to install truck tolling on the main roads. And this has been again on the discussion for maybe 5 to 10 years. 10 years ago, of course, there was a technology challenge, which is not the case anymore now. But decision on such a matter is really difficult. It involves the civil society. It involves a certain number of lobbies and groups, interest groups. So for the time being, there has not been any decision since this discussion was started. For Uzbekistan, for me, it's an example which comes and goes. They had a road fund in 1903, which is basically right after independence. And this was strengthened in 2003 and was sitting under the Ministry of Finance. And so it was really independent from the road institutions. Interestingly, the income to the road tax was not based on fuel. It was based on the corporate tax on businesses. So it's not directly linked to road users. Another interesting in Uzbekistan is that this is a country that didn't have a Ministry of Transport for 20 years since its independence. Ministry of Transport only exists since 5 years now. So there was no coordination between the different sectors. So for railways, they had a railway company, for roads, a road company, for aviation, an aviation company. Now there is only now it's starting to be a little bit coordination between the transport modes. Now in 2018, and with a change in government, the corporate tax was abolished. So the road fund lost its revenue, which was over 60% of its revenue was this corporate tax. So the importance, the strength, and the political position of the road fund was not the same anymore. It was integrated in the Committee of Roads and moved from the Ministry of Finance to the Ministry of Transport and the Committee of Roads, which may not be a good move. There is a small road fund which remains, which collects the remaining revenues, but it is not significant and it's not as powerful as it used to be. And that's why I was saying before that if you have a road fund and you are very ambitious with this road fund, the road fund is under threat immediately by many other actors of the government. So now Uzbekistan is looking at truck tolling, but not in the same way as Kyrgyzstan. and Uzbekistan is looking at PPP and toll roads generally to raise additional revenue. One of the big problems in Uzbekistan currently would be still that the road sector is very much in one institution, the Committee of Roads. There are not clear divisions between responsibilities, and that brings us back maybe 30 years back compared to other countries now. So the example of Serbia is interesting because they have a public company for the management of roads. There never was a road fund, but they had earmarked revenues. So the road law earmarked 10% of the fuel excise tax as a direct revenue for Roads of Serbia, which is the road agency. This was in 2005. Starting from 2012, this fuel excise tax actually did not reach the accounts of pairs. That means it was identified, but it was not paid by the government to pairs. And then in 2015, it was revised and this threshold is abolished. So now Roads of Serbia is just getting a budget subvention, a contribution. The other interesting thing in Serbia is that it has one road agency, which includes the public toll roads. And the revenues from the toll, their own toll, are not used only for the maintenance of the highways, but for the maintenance of the whole network. So this revenue would be sufficient for maintenance of the highways, but it is obviously not sufficient for the maintenance of the whole network. So it's supplemented by some subvention, as I call it, from the government, which is very irregular and with very difficult to manage with variable budgets. So the road company has signed a service level agreement with the ministry, which is quite advanced management structure. So PERS has to report to the ministry on the outputs in terms of performance, key performance indicators. And this is an initiative which is just starting. And one of the indicators is a minimum funding for the maintenance, which is interesting because this budget is actually a subvention of the government. So the government strategy, again, is to develop toll collection. So not only for highways, but also on express with a free flow toll system. Basically, you pass through a gate and it's charged, so it's a distance charging. And they're also looking at truck toll. For Laos, which is the last example, Laos has a road fund functioning since 20 years. The road fund was a little bit, let's say, restructured in 2016 and was renamed also, and in its structure changed from a road maintenance fund to a road fund, which means that initially it was with its earmarked revenues dedicated to road maintenance, and now it is dedicated to the road sector generally. This has a very big impact because, for example, if we now develop roads, costs towards land acquisition, resettlement are paid from the road fund now, which was not possible before. But the road fund is now used for a lot of other things, including not only the road sector. So it is better to have a road maintenance fund and not a road fund, generally speaking. Now, most of the road funds revenue in Laos come from the fuel excise tax. This is a fixed price in kip, 520 kip per liter, which is not much, 2 euro cents. The interesting thing here is that this has not been changed, but the Lao kip has devaluated after COVID by almost 100% in 1 year. So the actual revenue of the road fund increases in local revenue, but it decreases when taking into USD. And this does make a problem because actually road maintenance depends a lot on import of bitumen, import of fuel, which is probably 30% of the cost of maintenance, is the fuel for the vehicles who do this maintenance. So the fact that its revenue in USD or in convertible currency decreased has been a significant problem, and with road maintenance being underfunded now because the revenue is not sufficient anymore. As for many other countries, which Serge mentioned, 97% is from fuel levy currently. So the change to any other type of vehicles will directly affect, and it's already starting. Now this border of China and has a lot of imported electric vehicles in China. It's progressing very, very strongly, and it's a real concern to the government. So based on these examples, and these are practical examples and institutional examples of how this works, it's a really interesting, so how to keep the momentum. Most of the time, road funds, at least in my experience, have been implemented with the support from one financier, one donor. The ADB plays a role there, the World Bank plays a role there, to push the governments for earmarking, and usually it's part of a larger loan for investment in the road sector. But it is not always fully understood what are the challenges of the road maintenance and what are the needs for the maintenance, and how much this road maintenance is actually contributing to economic development. So the lenders play a role to set it up, but then the project's finished, the roles changed, and it is very difficult for the government or for the road sector, let's say, to keep in place this earmarking and these road funds. The donors drop out. It is a question of self-regulation of the country, and the long-term sustainability of this maintenance funding has to go through an understanding of contribution of road maintenance or the road sector to the national economy, like it is for hospitals, like it is for education. And of course, it's important to monitor how much money is actually allocated compared to what is collected. Serge had these interesting examples of country collecting less than spending on the road. And I think these are exceptions. In all the countries I know, the road revenues collected mainly through fuel excise are multiple times the budget which is allocated to roads. And the second, before I conclude, what about the future? So as I said, they mostly rely on fuel tax. No country allocates all fuel taxes to the road sector. So the example of Kyrgyzstan now with 50% is already exceptional, rather 10 to 20%. But the fuel tax is really considered as an income for the treasury. It's really considered as a tax. It's very different to toll, because toll is considered as a service, or polluter pays principle. You pay at the toll station for the use of the road. And this money usually stays within the toll road companies, be it concession to the private sector or be it public. In the case of Serbia, as I said, Serbia is a very strange example. It's at least remaining on the roads for the time being, but the government also considers that this toll could be a direct revenue to the treasury. Let's say overall, toll is considered as going to the road sector per se. As I said, road funds, they come and go, and earmarking also come and go with the generations. We had first road funds generation, second road fund generation, third road fund generation. But overall, it's a matter of policy. It's a matter of government decisions. So even if you implement a road fund, this is not the most difficult one. The most difficult one is to keep it over time. Now, my question, which I find interesting in this respect, is when distance charging is coming up. We talked about truck tolling, but also free flow tolling. It's interesting to see how this will be considered. If it's alternative to fuel tax, will it be considered as a tax, meaning a revenue to the government? Or will it be considered as a toll, meaning a polluter pays principle for a service, and will remain in the road sector? And I think this is one of the big challenges with the change from the fuel excise tax to any other tax on electricity, on distance, to keep this tax within the road sector and not as a general revenue. thank you. I think this is it from my side, and I will stop sharing and we can go to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you. And might as well start with Simon's question here, which I suspect, Serge, you've had a look at, around the viability of transferring essentially the fuel levy onto those alternative energy sources, electricity. And have you got any thoughts on the practicalities, viability, or otherwise on that?
Yeah, so I didn't respond to it in writing because I thought it would be better to discuss it verbally. It is something that we're looking at because from a theoretic perspective, it makes sense to transfer the fuel tax revenue to electricity tax revenue because it would have the same advantages of easy collection, low collection costs, and also forming a usage type of road user revenue. So people who use more pay more. But as you mentioned in your question, it is difficult to distinguish between electricity usage that is for electric vehicles and electricity usage that is for all kinds of other destinations, especially if people charge their vehicles at home. If they do it in public charging stations, then of course it's a lot easier. There are technical options out there. There, at least in Holland, in my country, the electricity companies are able to distinguish between different electricity usages based on the volume and the way that the electricity is used. But it's not 100% accurate, of course, and it requires quite very good smart meters in each household. You also have options of having separate electricity meters for your vehicle charging stations, but in many of the developing countries, we're still dealing with first generation electric vehicles that are just plugged into an electric socket, so that doesn't work as easily either. Our initial conclusions are that it would be very difficult to transfer that. You will collect some electricity tax because most countries have some kind of tax on the use of electricity, albeit very limited. And as soon as you start using electricity for electric vehicles, you will start paying more of that tax. So that revenue will increase, but it will by no means will it replace the level of tax recovered from fuel usage. And the other thing is that it depends a bit on the country. But again, taking the example of my own country, we have a lot of excise tax on fuel, and most of it is not used for the road sector. We have a separate road tax that is paid for by vehicle owners for road maintenance. But this excise tax, part of it's used for road improvements, road construction. Most of it just goes to the general budget. And as Alexandra mentioned, it's seen as a general revenue. But also we have a very high excise tax on fuel, just like we have on cigarettes, because we want to destimulate the usage of fuel. So we want to push people into public transport. Converting that to electricity where we actually want them to use electricity is not straightforward. So the second study that we're looking at will look at different technologies. They will also look at electricity taxes, but I expect that the preferred alternative will be some kind of vehicle-based tax because they already exist and they're easier to apply.
Excellent.
Yes, and just to add one thing, it also depends on the relative percentage and of the cost of electricity and of fuel. My country, France, for example, has very cheap electricity because of atomic energy. And calculating the percentage of tax you would need to add to this to actually recover a similar revenue is absolutely enormous. And then publicly, it is simply not acceptable by the population. So it's socially not an acceptable tax.
You've been known to have a few protests in France over fuel prices, haven't you?
Yeah, we have them our fuel prices, but also the government tried to introduce this vehicle linked electricity tax. And of course, we started demonstrating again, and the government puts it in its pocket. So I would imagine that this type of tax is very difficult for any government to put in place. Yeah.
It's an interesting side aspect. Like in the road sector, we look at this as a risk to road maintenance. Yeah, we go a transition from ICEs to EVs. Will we have the money to fund the roads? But in so many of the case studies we look at, it's actually a real issue for funding of social services, isn't it? And is that like how do we get the message that this isn't just an issue for how do we repair a road? This is actually an issue for governments to get serious about, because it is fundamental to how they're funding, whether it's education, whether it's health or otherwise. Any thoughts on that space, Alexandra?
Yes, sorry, I was looking at the next question, so I think I missed the point of your.
Well, my comment is just, we within the road sector, we look at this as a road sector risk, but really it is a bigger issue for it's a societal risk.
It's a budget risk for most of the countries. It's especially European countries, including the Netherlands, including France. It's simply a budget issue here. In France, I think it's about 40% of the budget revenue, which is from the fuel excise tax, which is huge. Fuel excise plus the VAT, of course, which is huge. Yeah. And I think Netherlands is similar, Denmark is similar, all Nordic countries.
Yeah. So in Holland, we collect 8 billion euros a year from fuel taxes. And that is a big amount of money to of course, you won't lose it overnight. It will take time, but it's a lot of money that, and the government is starting to get worried about it, because in Holland, there's a big push for electric vehicles. So we are now I think we're at 6% of the vehicle fleet, and it's starting to get an impact. And at the same time, the electric vehicles have a lot of exemptions from other taxes, from road tax, for instance. So they aren't paying those either. And all that together is having a big impact.
Yeah. I know in New Zealand, where I live, the government has very much got rid of all of those incentives and freedoms and moved the electric vehicles into the road, into a distance-based charging, just to, it's a small proportion of our fleet, but just to head in the right direction, I guess. A question for both of you, really. The role of good asset management as a basis for road funds. I see some countries when I'm traveling, they've done the asset management to understand the funding needs and have created, whether it's a road fund, but created a revenue regime that aligns with that. So there's sort of this credible, we need $1 and we've collected $1, the dollar goes with the dollar. We see other countries clearly that it's just how much can we grab? And so there's a complete mismatch. Any thoughts on the role of asset management in all of this? Is it essential to have asset management to have a good road fund?
I would say it's essential to have some kind of asset management. The technological detail of it will vary by country, but you need a good idea of what your maintenance needs are to actually justify the amount of money that you're asking for, either earmarked to a road fund or asking from government. And you would like that to be as objective as possible, so it's not influenced by political priorities or other influences. So a road asset management system and proper data collection, proper data analysis, that can help you in that process. But it doesn't mean that if you have a good road asset management system that you're actually going to get the money. That is always difficult. And that comes back to a discussion that Alexandra had about road tolling, that road tolling is seen as the revenue needs to go to the road sector because it's seen as logical, whereas with the fuel tax and other taxes, it's more like a decision. And an example of that is Pakistan. When they set up the National Highway Authority, they set up road asset management system. They determined how much funding they needed. The idea was to have a road fund financed by a fuel tax, but they couldn't reach an agreement on that. So in the end, it's paid by tolls, and toll revenue has its limitations. You can't just increase the toll revenue as much as in order to fill all your needs. So for them, it's a limitation. Even though they have a decent road asset management system, they see that over time, there's a bigger and bigger gap between their needs and what they're actually collecting.
Yeah, and to add one thing, in my experience in the countries where there is a road fund, the road fund is actually sort of a guarantee that your road asset management is used. Road fund has an interest that the roads are well managed. And looking at this specifically and probably in more detail than would generally Ministry of Transport do or the Ministry of Finance. So now, in my opinion, these road funds have a positive impact on the asset management in terms of institutional.
Yeah, I know in Papua New Guinea, when I was up there recently, and we had that discussion that at the moment, asset management, data collection and those sort of things, it's sort of inferred in the legislation that the road fund could be used to do that. And we've made some suggestions that should be more explicit, that it must do that so that the data collection is actually there to make good use of the road fund. Alexandra, the question there from Stephen around road accident funds or similar, have you seen something in that space separately to a road fund?
No, oops. No, I have never seen any road accident funds, but in developed countries, people are insured, and it's the insurance is covering this. And when I was working on the motorway company, actually even the cost of accidents towards the infrastructure was covered by the insurance company. So if through an accident they demolish a guardrail or something, we would claim it from the insurance company. I don't have any examples in mind that there's any charge or any contribution linked to accidents in any way.
I know in New Zealand,
maybe different. It's not a road accident fund, but you do have, for instance, in Zambia, the road fund, it finances road maintenance, but it also provides financing to the road safety authority. So that's more for road safety measures and road safety awareness campaigns and stuff like that. So it's not really a road accident fund, but it is related to reducing the number of accidents and the seriousness of accidents.
Yeah, in New Zealand we've got that side of it, and then a portion of our vehicle licensing goes to what's called the Accident Compensation Corporation, which is our government-owned entity that if you're in a car crash, that's the entity that fixes you up and gets you back working, or if you're unable to work because of permanent disability, it helps you in that regard. So again, not quite the same, but I guess different ways to look at that. I am aware of the time. I don't know if anyone wants to, either of you want to quickly grab Joseph's question there about if you're not going to use the road fund for, if you're not using the road fund to do road development, where should you get it from?
Well, I think this is not a good question, from my opinion, because most governments like to make road development, and they always find, and it's financed from loans often, very often. But I think you should see it the other way around. You first should fill your budget as needed to do the proper maintenance of your assets before developing your assets. And for this reason, I am thinking that earmarking for maintenance is the priority. So you have a stable income for maintenance. And once you have covered all your maintenance needs, and most countries never reach that point, then you should look at development. Of course, you can always have small developments, but countries which invest in very large projects, hundreds of kilometers of new roads, which are having in place a maintenance funding for this, I think that is a real problem.
Okay. And now one quick question, or one question with quick answers from both of you. When you see countries which have got a good funding regime in place, whether that is road fund or not road fund, what's the common trait? Like what do you see as being the key drivers of a successful funding of the road sector?
In the end, it comes down to fiscal diligence, I believe. That if a country sees the value of the road network for their economy, for their society, and sees the value of investing in road maintenance as the most efficient way of providing a good service for that road network, that is the main requirement. Then you still have some differences between how countries look at it. I mean, if you look at Europe, if you go from Holland to Belgium, you see a difference in the road quality, and that the Dutch, we spend way too much on roads, in my view, and then the Belgians probably spend a little bit too, don't spend enough, but it's also where you put your priorities. But in the end, you see that in both countries, the road networks do what they need to do. They provide the access that you need.
Thank you. Anything to add to that, Alexandra?
I could add a lot of things. This is a very interesting topic, but we are over the time already. So I think Serge's answer is very complete. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a few more questions there. I think we have the ability to answer them separately online. But I'd just like to thank both the speakers. Serge can now make his way to an airport and travel to the remote corners of the Pacific. So thank you both for giving your time. Thanks for the participants who stayed with us. And like I say, in another 2 weeks, we'll be doing a session on with disaster management via the University of Melbourne. So thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.